Hello, everyone. I'm here once again. This time I'm here to discuss the Volcarona suspect. Um, yeah. So we'll start. I will say this is again one of the funniest suspect threads that I've seen in a long time. Um, this one and Gouging Fire have definitely been the best suspect threads and discussions and discourse since Dracovish in Gen 8 OU. That was a very funny suspect thread, and this is going to be another absolute hilarious one. So, to start, let's get into the nitty gritty of why Volcarona is getting suspected in the first place. Since Gen 5, its introduction, Volcarona has always been deemed a very matchup fishy mon. That is to say, whenever it loads a team that it is very good against, it does incredibly well. Whereas that might not be the case for a team which is better equipped versus it. Um, this is made even worse and exacerbated by the various coverage moves and utility moves that Volcarona can run. For example, there are bulkier sets with Quiver Dance and Roost. There are more offensive sets with Quiver Dance and 3 attacks, where the third attack can be anything from Giga Drain to Psychic to fuck to like Hurricane and Rain to a multitude of other moves. So Quiver Dance is a necessity on Volcarona, as are Heavy Duty Boots as the item. But then from there, aside from Fiery Dance or your Fire Stab, your last two slots are very, very free to change up based on your team, what works best for you, and what you think will do the most damage. And the issue that people have always had with Volcarona, even before it gained a hazard immunity, was the fact that it could run a certain set, like it could run sub QD, and that would invalidate some answers to it. It could run a third move that would invalidate some answers to it, such as Psychic, which is much better into Toxapex than Volcarona normally is, or Giga Drain, which is much better into some specially defensive Pokemon than Volcarona normally is. Or it can run Roost, which lengthens its longevity at the cost of a move that it can run. So that's just based off of his base moveset. I haven't even started talking about the monstrosity that is Terra yet. But now let me give you a history lesson. Throughout Gens 5 through 7, Volcarona was able to run Hidden Power, which means that it got a free coverage type of its choice. Typically, that was Ground because of Heatran, the quintessential and perennial Volcarona counter, more or less. Um, but sometimes it would be something different. Throughout Gens 5 through 7, Volcarona also did not have access to heavy duty boots, which means that despite being very matchup fishy and very dependent on matchup, as well as being a very hated mon by a lot of players in these metagames, it was hampered by the fact that it took 50% from Stealth Rock, which was, and still is, the most common hazard and a mandate on every team in pretty much every gen, especially in Gen 5, definitely in Gen 6, and it's really idiotic not to have Stealth Rock on your team in Gen 7. Moving into Gen 8, Volcarona gained the use of heavy duty boots. That means that it was now able to completely circumvent hazard damage given that it had its item and it was knocked off. But it also lost hidden power in Gen 8, meaning that it was limited to the few moves that it does get as coverage. Aside from its stabs and Fiery Dance, Flamethrower, Fire Blast, and its Fire Stab, and Bug Buzz and its Bug Stab, it was limited to moves like Air Slash, Hurricane, Giga Drain, and Psychic for its last move. However, it could also run Roost and Substitute, and there was definitely several periods where people were very frustrated with the way that Volcarona was centralizing team building in Gen 8. Now, moving into Gen 9, with all this context behind us, we can see why Volcarona is so absurdly stupid. Because the two things that were holding it back in generations 5 through 7 and 8 respectively now do not exist. Heavy Duty Boots allows Volcarona to circumvent all hazards damage, including its 50% Rocks weakness, while Terra-type Terra Blast allows it to circumvent its need for coverage. For example, Terra Ground Terra Blast completely blasts past the Heatran, which has been consistently considered one of the best answers to Volcarona. this is an issue because now it is able to completely flip the matchup on its head. That's an issue with Terra in general. I would call it an issue. Some people would call it a blessing. Uh, but that doesn't change the fact that essentially now Volcarona gets the two things that it needs to circumvent its two biggest issues. So this is really what's put Volcarona over the edge in terms of both team building and battling. Um, the variance in sets is insane. Frankly, you can run Terra Ground, Terra Blast, Terra Dragon, Terra Blast is a good option. Quiver Dance, Fiery Dance, and then Roost in the last slot is a great option. Bug Stab is not necessary really um, anymore. You're still more than able to run Psychic or Giga Drain. You're able to run niche Terra types like Fairy and Water to circumvent some of your checks and flip some counterplay. You're able to run Hurricane, Terra Flying Hurricane in certain teams. And that's like just sort of the tip of the iceberg. It could go so much deeper, and it will go so much deeper in terms of discussion, moving into the suspect thread that I'm about to talk about. So that is the issue with Volcarona, the crux of it. I will also mention really quickly that before the suspect thread went up, there was a policy review committee discussion about whether or not Terra Blast should be the focus of a potential suspect, simply because Terra Blast allows Pokemon to gain free coverage that allow them to circumvent their checks. The general consensus, though, during that policy review committee thread was that Terra Blast was not an issue, and it's not necessarily one that flips counters very much. The only real mons that run it are Volcarona, some other coverage hungry mons like the occasional King Gambit, and then Terra Stellar users with contrary like Superior and Enamorous. Aside from that, there's not exactly a whole abundance of Terra Blast users that are using that free coverage to flip their matchups. So, with all this being said, we will move into the suspect thread and just sort of discuss some of the viewpoints that are being given and taken in this thread. Um, Moving on. I will mention real quick that OU Forum leader Osma, as well as probably the entire rest of the OU Council and everyone who cares about the OU metagame, started this with a plea to, be fucking civil and not stupid in this thread. This is due to like the gouging fire suspect thread and recent events that happened in the OU metagame discussion thread about a tweet Finchinator made about a council discussion about dropping Palafin, Solgaleo, and two other broken mons, or Annihilate and one other broken mon. Um, and they were, Daddy Buzzwole of Gouging Fire Suspect fame was really on Finchinator's dick for that. It was just a very bad 10 pages of metagame discussion. Um, but the entire metagame discussion thread is similarly terrible, so it's not something that is necessarily new. Um, Something to notice, it took literally 4 hours for the first post to go up, which, makes this first line, this is the quietest opening to an OU suspect thread I've ever seen, very, very true. I don't think I've ever seen an OU suspect thread where it's been 4 hours since opening. That could be just because of uh people being more guarded to express their views very like vocally because of the increased moderation, but I doubt that. So yeah. So starting off, we see a lot of pro ban posts. Ultimately, all of these really boil down to a couple of main points. So I'm not gonna discuss any of these pro ban points too heavily. Uh, but essentially, the first point, RNG matchup Cheesemon, um, and then Gen 9 meta context. Those are the in the context of the Gen 9 meta, an RG matchup Fish Cheesemon in a meta with a lot of threats that already draw a lot of tension in team building and gameplay is probably not the greatest. So yeah, that's the initial post. I'm not really gonna go into um a lot of discussion here because all of this stuff is just pretty much the same, and there are 5 pages of this that I want to get through. Um, I will point out real quick, Daddy Buzzwell says that he doesn't have strong feelings towards one position or the other, which woohoo, because now we get to see a suspect there that's actually fucking useful. Then I make my own post here. If I were to have a poor matchup, it would definitely cause me trouble. So you'd lose? Nah, I'd win. I was very proud of that. But moving on. I made the same points that I discussed at the start of this video about how now it's free of all of its weaknesses. I also made a point here that I'll point out real quick. I personally don't believe that Volcarona restricts team building more than King Gambit or Ogre W. Just because of the way that those two like work. Like Ogre completely cooks all balances ever. King Gambit is just cooks every team ever. Um, so I don't think that it restricts team building more, but I would say it restricts gameplay more. And I'm just gonna read straight off the post because I thought this analogy was great. Think of it like Schrodinger's cat. If instead of a cat, it was a bloodthirsty demon moth, which will tear you to bits. Except before Schrodinger opens the box, there are about 10 of them in the box all at the same time, each ready to kill you with their varied coverage or spreads. And yet, even if you guess right before you open the metaphorical box, it is still very likely that the demon moth will do huge damage. Um, I think I was cooking with that. That's my personal view on Volcarona and how it operates right now. I think that even a set that has a poor matchup, like say you bring like Quiverdan's Roost 2 moves, two attacks, into a matchup where like a Terra Blast Dragon would be much better, like and more like appreciated better. I still think that's gonna do huge damage. It's still gonna be sorry. It's, it's still gonna be a huge threat. Um yeah. Oh, by the way, I got Mega Metagross Rex. Yeah, I'm pretty proud of that one. But then moving on, a lot of uncompetitive talk, and then here's the first anti-ban argument, which is very, very bad in my opinion. Basically, they're saying that banning Volcarona would be bad because Volcarona provides a lot of roll compression because it's able to threaten steals, come in on Moonblasts, and threaten physical attackers with Flame Body. Now, I didn't discuss the defensive utility of Volcarona at the start of this video, mainly because I don't think it has any. I think that the arguments about it being um like a tool defensively, a good tool defensively, are frankly like a bit stupid. Because its defense essentially falls around using Flame Body, fishing for a burn, and then occasionally coming in on a resisted hit from a Steel type or like a Moonblast. Um, and that's not really defensive utility at all because every offensive mon can do that to some degree. Volcarona has a slightly better offensive or defensive typing in this context because of the typing of common moves in this meta, but I don't necessarily think that that makes it very good defensively. But moving on, basically, this dude's saying a bunch of fucking horseshit about how Volcarona compresses so many roles and people are bitching about how like there's so much pressure in the builder. Basically, this guy really doesn't want to give up his Volcarona teams because then he's gonna have to find actual answers to Moonblast and fucking Gambit and Gold. Um, I'm also hating, so I'm not actually like beefing with this dude or whatever, but like I just think at this point is very fundamentally wrong. Um, then people talk about they talk about how the matchup moth is basically another way of saying a Pokemon is unreliable, which is again another point that I don't think is very good. You can be a matchup fish in a way that doesn't make it so that a poor matchup makes you bad. That I think is what Volcarona falls into. You can be a matchup fish in the way that Volcarona can pretty much insta win on an opening with a good matchup, while still like being able to do huge work in a maybe not as good matchup. I don't think that there's ever a bad matchup for Volcarona unless it loads like pure stall, literally. Um, and then there's just a bunch of horse shit. Grass spam is gonna cook Volcarona. We can remove the matchup mod. Basically, there's just a bunch of really dog shit arguments about how like removing Volk would cook the meta, and that's why you should keep it. Again, this is not a good argument. This is essentially just trying to keep Volk in the meta for a broken checks broken approach, which is not something that Smogon tiering policy is aiming to do. If anything becomes uncompetitive or broken after Volcarolan's ban, that's something which should be discussed in future tiering action, but not something which should be considered in the context of the Pokemon itself. I want to really quickly point out this paragraph right here. We are seeing paradoxical. The enemy is both strong and weak logic to describe Volk. Somehow his defensive presence is both a reason to ban it, but also not that good, so it's not important enough to keep it in the tier. I don't have anything to say about this, but I will scroll down real quick and show you what the original pre-edit um, line was right here. Um, we'll skip this. Actually, no, we'll cover this real quick because this is a really good point. Essentially talking about how there are like Smogon does tend to tolerate broken threats if they are like valuable to the metagame. Essentially then saying that like Volcarona is broken and not necessarily providing enough value to the metagame to be like something that the tier can be centralized around, which I agree with. I think that at this point we sort of devolved around King Gambit and Water Pawn being and like Zamazenta as well to a degree, like they mentioned. Um being sort of like these central threats that even though they might like be broken, the value they provide to the metagame is immense. Um, so yeah, this is a great point right here, and I absolutely fucking love this point. And so now we'll see what the pre-edit thing is right here. We are seeing the paradoxical, the enemy is both strong and weak logic used by fascist regimes. Regimes. I just said regimes. Fuck. We are seeing the paradoxical, the enemy is both strong and weak logic used by fascist regimes to describe Volk. This is like a top three line ever uttered in like an OU forum ever. I think the only line that's better was that one line in the metagame discussion post Terraban, where the guy was like, I'm not your brother and you're not fit to call him Christ. I'll make a vid about that later. But this is insanity. Um, so then a sentence which I don't think has pretty much ever been uttered in uh, competitive forums is uttered right here. Please do not make comparisons to fascism or any kind of political powers for that matter in this thread. Thank you. Um, shit is funny as fuck. I don't know what else to say. Then we get introduced to C-Tan. C-Tan is a very he's like the CTC of the thread. If CTC wasn't a dick about like the arguments that they were making. Um, their main point boils down to how people use Volcarona for his defensive profile with offensive upside when its matchup is good. I disagree with that. I think that people use Volcarona for its offensive profile, which gets elevated to another level when its matchup is good. And in addition, its defensive usage, RNG wise, and its ability to resist some key attacks with its good special defense stat are added bonuses. For example, I don't think that people would ever use him on like Volcarona if it didn't have Quiver Dance. Like I think Volcarona would probably be a UU mon or even like RU if it didn't have Quiver Dance. Um, which just sort of shows like the upside when the matchup is good is not necessarily as like overstate or like as like apparent as this poster wants you to believe. Um, but then like they're basically talking about how you can stack checks, you can use like terras and whatnot. Um, but it's just like not a great argument and sounds just like it just stinks of like I want to keep Volcarona in this tier for my own usage. Um, not that that's something that I'm accusing this poster of, but just like the ideas are very like silly, really. Like the idea that, you know, you can stack checks, you can do whatever. All of this is moot when you have a bad matchup. And then moving on. We see a lot of posts here. This shit, I'm not gonna even cover this post because here's the TLDR. And this is just blatantly wrong. Especially for the grass band bit. I won't talk about fairies and Kyurem. Kyurem will probably get banned if Volcarona is not here. Um, realistically, and I think that Kyurem should have been banned in his first suspect. Um, but grass spam is not going to be good in this fucking meta. Like, if Volcarona leaves. Like, Volcarona is not the thing that's holding, like, grass spam back from, like, running amok on the fucking OU ladder or the OU metagame in general. As for fairies, Volcarona is a very key resist, but others do exist in the tier, such as Heatran. Um, so I don't think that that's necessarily a great point either. And again, the point of tiering policy is if something gets broken after a ban, then you go and you ban it. That's exactly how tiering should fucking work. And then Finch says exactly that. Preserving something because it checks Pokemon is a bad argument. If it's broken, it should be banned. If not, it shouldn't. It's really silly seeing the Volcarona saving from Moonblast from Valiant or Ice Beam from Kyurem. If those things are broken after Volcarona goes, they will be handled as well. That's exactly the point, which completely shuts down all of the arguments anti-suspect or anti-ban in this thread, in my opinion, from here on out. So I'm gonna pause and move on to the next interesting bit because the rest of this is sort of just reiteration, more or less. So yeah, I'll be back. I'm back. The only thing you really need to know from the part that I paused is that there's a lot of very interesting, not even interesting, a lot of very bland replay analysis that goes on, as well as another dozen posts from CTAN regarding how, super not broken Volcarona is. Most of it's just not interesting at all. But if you do want to read some of these replay analyses, then feel free to in the thread. I will link it below. Um, but we'll move to the next actually good point. This is one of my favorite posts in the thread. Um, this is like really, really, really fucking cook. All right. So look at this graph real quick. You see balance rating, you see the line, and then you see the dip, and you see the rise, right? Um, see the star right there, the you are here mark, and this person starts to elaborate on this right here. Regarding my previous comment, here's an illustration. The x-axis is the number of bands in OU and the y-axis is the tier balance rating. The solid line is a gross simplification of past tragedy, while the dashed line is a future tragedy hypothetically. So the star here represents where the tier is. And the broken meta is a local maximum of tier balance. So as you can see here, it is higher than what comes before it, and it's higher than what comes after it. But it's not the highest in the actual graph. Ban any one broken model of defensive utility and others get out of hand, and the overall balance of the tier decreases. But with enough additional bans that follow this initial destabilization, the tier could restabilize at another maxima, the absolute maxima of balance. This is, I think, one of the best points, and it's unfortunate that it went under the radar. I don't think that the broken checks broken meta should really be considered like a point in Volcarona's favor at all. And this is a big reason why. So moving forward, um, there was also some talk in the suspect thread about how Terrablast should be, banned and shit, but there was a whole policy review thread, which I guess I'll link below as well, the um about the Volcarona versus Terrablast suspect. Um, so then we move forward, and there's just like a lot of talk about Terrablast, and you know, a lot of talk specifically about how if Volcarona is banned, blah 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 happens, Iron Valiant gets out of hand, Grass Spam gets out of hand, Kyurem gets out of hand, like, shit like that. And it's just like really starts getting really repetitive and annoying. And then Finch makes a post. It's unfortunate but not surprising how this thread has evolved from Volcarona suspect thread into personal pro and con lists of Volcarona. This goes for both sides. Some messages even go deeper, focusing their arguments on Theorymon about a pulse Volcarona tier where Iron Valiant or Enamorous would be broken. Spoiler, neither were even close to broken last time Volcarona got banned. Things like this are why suspect threats continue to be seen as a joke throughout the community, honestly, and Finchinator is spitting here. This threat is a fucking joke. There's not much else to say. I'll move to the next good point. If there is one, I'm gonna pause. Just a quick update. There were no other actually good points. There is something that is somewhat substantial by Daddy Buzzwell as the dead last post of the thread so far, which essentially just discusses how people really think that broken only means one thing while it could mean several other things, which is a fair point, but it's not one that really matters because people who get Rex are going to vote ban or no ban based on their own preferences, and they're not going to be following smogon policy, like some fucking like monk. So ultimately, this is the thread so far. These are the arguments which have been laid in favor of and against Volcarona's ban. If it's not abundantly obvious, I'm very pro-ban for Volcarona. I don't really buy a lot of the anti-ban arguments. And I think that a lot of the ones that are being floated around are just a result of Volcarona being so good in the tier. For example, um, it's poor like turn up, I guess, or it's poor like performance in tournaments is not indicative of the fact that it's bad, but more that people over prep for it, as seen in some of the replays where a team which is very good into Volcarona gets cooked by something else. But ultimately, I don't know if I'm gonna get Rex. I'm sort of busy these next 2 weeks, but if I do, I'm going to be going ban. Um, I will make another video, perhaps at the end of this suspect, discussing both the outcome of the suspect and the policy review thread about Volcarona versus Terra Blast, because that has pretty big implications for tiering in the rest of the gen. Other than that, just thank you all, and I will see you in the next video.